Cool. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the third lecture of WDB Basic Stack. Essentially, today we're going to talk about JavaScript. It's going to be an introduction of JavaScript. So, JavaScript 1. And though it's only an introduction, actually, there are quite a lot of things to cover. Actually, let's talk through the logistics first. So the project one is going to be due on Friday. And here's a link to the project if you haven't checked it out. We won't release the JavaScript homework until the project's due, so no worry about the new homework. And yeah, so today we're going to talk about JavaScript. We're going to cover the basic syntax of JavaScript. And basic syntax is it's pretty easy if you already are familiar with one of the higher level languages, for example Python. And then we're going to talk about JavaScript objects, and then JavaScript functions, and also something that's pretty tricky in JavaScript is scope and closure. And finally, we're going to close the lecture by teaching some DOM manipulation using JavaScript. So yeah. Let's get to it. And yeah, this is just kind of the three pillars of web development. And we have already covered HTML, we have already covered CSS, and now we are on to the final pillar, which is the JavaScript. And JavaScript is essentially the powerhouse of any web applications. So if you see a button and then you click on it and some fancy stuff happens, for example, a window pops up, that's basically stuff that JavaScript do. And it's a high level language, kind of similar to Python. And it's essentially in charge of all the interesting behaviors on a website. And here we can see a quick snippet of a JavaScript basic syntax. So here there are two variables. One's weight, one's gravity. And there's a function here, it's calculate force. And by given two parameter, we return basically the multiplication, the result of weight times gravity. So yeah, we're going to cover variables, functions in more detail later. Actually, are there any questions? As I heard someone talking. Is it just someone forgetting to mute? Cool, okay. Yeah, just to make sure. Okay. Now basic syntax. So first of all, variables. Variables are the building blocks of any programming languages, and it's very important to study variables. Actually, in JavaScript, variables can be pretty tricky. And there are three ways to define a variable. First of all, it's the var keyword. A var keyword is the most normal common variables in JavaScript. And it's introduced before ES 2015. So ES 2015 is essentially a version of JavaScript. And before ES 2015, we only have var as the only way to define a variable. So essentially, you can use var name equals Alex, semicolon, and then you will get name will be have a value of Alex as a string. So yeah, this is the normal part of variable. And then comes the tricky part. So essentially after ES 2015, JavaScript introduced two more ways to define a variable. The first is const, and the second is let. So const essentially it's a constant, which means that it's a constant. Essentially, you cannot change the value of it once it's defined. So we usually use it to define something that's not going to change. For example, gravity. Here in the snippet on the right, you can see the constant gravity equals 9.6. And if you're trying to assign a new value, say 10 to gravity, it will basically have an error. And you essentially cannot do that because it's a constant. And there's also another way to define a variable called let. Let is very similar to var. However, it's block scoped. And we'll introduce block scope later. But for now, you can understand it as kind of something that's very similar to let. to var. So yeah. And actually, we can have a pic of what's block scope here on the bottom right snippet. So as you can see, in this if class, we define the variable x, and as we say that x equals to 2. And x can be used outside the if statement, the if block. And this is called the block scope. So essentially, like var ignore any block scope. If a var variable is defined within an if statement, it can be used anywhere else. However, let is very different. If you define a let variable inside the block, inside the if block or else if block or else block, the y here can only be used within this if clause. You cannot use outside the if clause. So this is something that is pretty unique to JavaScript, because like most of the language only use like function scope and global scope. However, JavaScript here has also a block scope. So yeah, this is pretty interesting. Okay, cool. Are there any questions till this point? No, okay. Yeah, let's move on. If you're still kind of confused about block scope and function scope, we're going to cover this in much more detail later. And now let's introduce conditional statements. So conditional statements are just the good old conditional statements that you will expect in any languages. And functions kind of like crossroads, not the cafeteria, but like an actual crossroad, where like if certain conditions are met, you execute the code. Otherwise, you can do essentially something else. So if we look at the code on the right, it's saying, so we first define a variable, it's time equals 21. In this if clause, if time is less than 10, we essentially, the greeting variable will be saying good morning, since it's like morning, it's before 10. Else if, it's essentially like, so if the if clause condition does not match, we'll go to the else if clause. So here, the time is equals to 21. So the else if clause does not match neither. As a result, we go to the else clause. The else clause is kind of like a catch-all clause, where like if the if clause and else if clause does not work, we will just go to the else clause. And since time is equals to 21, the greeting will become good evening. So yeah, this is conditional statements. And now let's see the for loop. There are actually quite a lot of variations for for loops within JavaScript. So like in Python, you will like I think the most common ones that you will use will probably just like for I in a particular range, like yeah. But however, in JavaScript, there are like quite a lot of different ways to write a for loop. So there's the normal for loop that you will expect. So for variable I equals 0, if I is less than 5, we go to the for loop. After we execute the code within the for loop, we increment I. Okay, so this is essentially like what you would expect for any for loops. And there's also a for in loop. So what's a for in loop? For in loop is essentially kind of like a syntax trigger for looping through properties within an object. We'll cover object in a little while, but essentially object kind of functions like a map or a dictionary in Python. But like there are like some subtle differences. We'll cover this later. But as you can see here, this person is an object. It has its name, first name, last name, and age. And to loop through this object, we can use the for in loop. So here, for variable x in person, we can console.log person x. So this is essentially like a way, person square bracket x is a way for for the programmer to access the object. Essentially, x for variable x in person is kind of like a way for you to access all the keys, all the properties within this object. Yeah, so this is for in loop. And there's also a for off loop. So for op loop, instead of looping through object, we loop through iterables. And iterables include, for example, array. So here we got an array of car brands. And essentially using the for off loop, you can loop through all the items or all the names of the car brands within the car array. So yeah. So this is essentially like 4 main ways that you can write a for loop inside JavaScript. And something to be careful here is that you need the bracket here for a for loop to work. It does not like function like Python where you do not need a bracket. So yeah, that's that. Cool. Are there any questions till this point? Cool. Let's move on. So this is for loop. And we also got a while loop. A while loop is like just a normal while loop. And you can write a while loop like here. And a while loop essentially it will execute the statement within the while loop if the condition is true. So essentially here, so let's say I equals to 0, and while I is less than 10, we will increment the text, we'll essentially concatenate to the text by saying the number is, for example, since I right now 0, it will say the number is 0. And then it will increment I, and I becomes 1. And until I becomes 10. And when I becomes 10, the while loop condition will basically becomes false because like 10 is not less than 10, it's equal to 10. And afterwards, the while loop will stop. So this is the good old while loop. And you can also use a do while loop. And do while loop is pretty much the same as the other languages as well. You will execute the code in the do clause once, and then check the condition, and then repeat the loop. So this is kind of like an alternative to a while loop, where like sometimes you need to execute the code once before checking the condition, and this is pretty like useful. So yeah, this is while loops. Cool. Are there any questions for while loops? Okay, yeah, let's move on. So these are the kind of like the most basic syntax of JavaScript. Now let's move on to something more like JavaScript related, JavaScript specific. So first of all, let's talk about JavaScript objects. Almost everything in JavaScript is an object, since it's kind of like an object-oriented programming language, except primitive types. So what's primitive types? It's like integers, strings, where like all those things that can be like defined within a computer that you are not like define yourself are primitive types. For example, Boolean is also a primitive type. And everything else essentially is an object. Object, like this is kind of like the general sense of object that we're talking about. When we want to be more specific, when we mention object in JavaScript, we kind of like think about a dictionary in Python, and there are like lots of differences. So for a JavaScript object, there you basically define it through this way. You use a curly bracket and put the type and value of the property and the value named here within the curly bracket, and you separate it using comma. And this is how you essentially like define an object. And this person object will have a first name property and the value is strong, and last name property and the value is dull, and the age 50 and eye color of blue. So yeah, this is an average person, like an average person object. An object can also have methods, and methods are actions that can be performed on objects. Let's see. Oh, actually, yeah. Let's first talk about how do we access properties within an object. So there are mainly 3 different ways for us to access a property of an object. First of all, the dot operator. The dot operator is just what it's saying here. It's a person dot first name equals Alex. And by using this will change the first name from John to Alex. You can access this way. Yeah. And the second is a square bracket. you can use the square bracket with the property like valid within it. So person first name, person square bracket first name square bracket equals Alex. You can also change the John to Alex. And the third way is a very dynamic way. It's using a square bracket and also the expressions. So essentially, let's first define a variable called P. The P is equals to first name, and person P will also give us the first name property, and we can also assign it to Alex. And this is a pretty useful way to actually like accessing properties of an object, because sometimes properties within an object can be dynamic, and we also want to access this through a very dynamic way. And this allows us to essentially like manipulate on the properties of an object by using a string. So yeah, and we can also loop through an object to wait, here are some messages in the chat. Oh, sure. And what, okay, let me address the question first. So the first question is, what will it print out the second loop, the in loop? So let's go back. Sorry, I just I ignored the message for a while. Let's see. So for the second for loop, this will essentially print out the value of the property. So this will be like pretty much more apparent when we just like finish talking about object, because var x in person, x is actually like the property of the properties within the person object, and person x, it will become essentially like accessing one of the properties. So this for loop will first print out John, and then Doe, and then 25. Yeah. Hope that answers your question. And let's see. What's the second? So the dot operator is not dynamic. Okay, so the dot operator can also be dynamic. Yeah, it can also be dynamic. Yeah, good catch, actually. So the dot operator and the square bracket can function like the same. Yeah, actually, I should probably double check after the lecture. I will get back to you. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure the square bracket can be dynamic. I've never used dot as a dynamic one, but yeah, let me double check. Cool. Okay. And also, there's a way for us to delete a property. And how to delete a property? We use the delete keyword. So essentially, just delete person.first name or like person square bracket first name. You can delete a property within the object. So yeah, so these are the three ways to access a property within an object, and also how to delete it. Is there any question till this point? Also, let me close the notification. Okay. Cool. If there's, let me check the chat. Okay. If there's no question, let's continue. So this is the object method, and this. Just like I mentioned in the beginning of the introduction of object, an object can also have a method, and this is kind of like the main distinguish point between JavaScript and Python. So essentially, here in the person object, we see there's a first name property, there's a last name property, there's an ID, and there's also a full name. And full name here follows a function, and this is how defining a function in JavaScript. We'll cover this in much more detail later. But right now, this is essentially like a very normal standard way that you can define a function. It's function, and the bracket here essentially is just taking parameters. And if no parameters specified, it means that the function does not require any parameter. And the curly bracket is essentially the body of the function. And it will return this dot first name plus a space plus this dot last name. So essentially what this function is trying to do is trying to concatenate the first name with the last name and separate them by a space. and this function will be assigned to the full name property. So essentially, full name property becomes not the string, not the result itself, but becomes a function. Okay, and how does the function access the first name and the last name of the person object? We do this by essentially using the this keyword, and this keyword is essentially a way for us to access things or properties within an object. So say you define a person object like this, and you can access the first name property through this dot first name, and this will basically like grab the property from first name. Here will be basically return drawn plus doe, and here if we access the name, access the full name through person dot full name, and we call the function, and this will return us the full name. So yeah. Are there any questions for object methods?
Yeah. So when you're calling the function full name, like it works because you're passing nothing in, right? So if like full name were to have a specific parameter, like say it takes an integer, you'd have to call like person dot full name and then pass 2 into it, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, how would you pass in parameters? First of all, you need to like write something here. So you need to write an argument here. So let's say function eye color. You can just like write eye color in the bracket, and then here you need to like input the argument through this way. So you essentially do person dot full name bracket, for example, blue, and then the argument here will be blue. So yeah, this is how you like get the argument.
And then when you specify the parameter, you don't need to be like var and then the name of the parameter. Like just the name of the parameter is fine, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like how Python works. It's
okay.
Just yeah, the name of the parameter. Cool, good questions. Are there any other questions? Also, we will be covering like function in much more detail later. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. And there's also something called the object constructor. So if we look at this is just like one way to define an object. If we do this, say if we want to define like 5 person, if we do this like 5 times, it's like duplicate code, first of all, and secondly, it's like not very elegant. So JavaScript has this called object constructor. An object constructor is essentially just a normal function. It's a function. You don't need to like capitalize person, but it's just the convention that for any object constructor, you capitalize the function name. And you can take in parameters. You don't necessarily need to take in parameters. I mean, these parameters can be like properties within the object can also be fixed. So yeah, there's like no need to input this, but here we choose to like assign them dynamically when we create it. So how this constructor works is that it takes 4 parameters in, and it will assign to the person object that you will be created. So it's after it takes in first, last, age, and I, you will first of all assign first to this dot first name, assign last to this dot last name, assign age to this dot age, assign I to eye color. And these 4, the first name, last name, age, and eye color will be the property, like will be the property of the person object that we are creating. And the first, last, age, I, essentially the 4 arguments will be the value to all these 4 properties. So let's see this in action. So here we have a my father. Here we have a my father object, or my father variable, and we want to define it as a new person. So how do we do this? We use a new keyword and followed by the constructor function. So how basically like how do JavaScript distinguish between an object constructor versus a normal function is through the new keyword. So if you just want it to be like a normal function, you just call it like person bracket, and that's pretty much it. However, if you want to like make the function as a object constructor, you use the new keyword. So here we use a new keyword as a new person. First name is John, last name is Doe, age is 50, eyes blue, and this way we'll create a person with these 4 properties and with these 4 values. And same for my mother. Are there any questions? I would say it's like very similar to class constructors, but you only construct an object. So that's like the only difference, I would say. Yeah. Cool. So this is object constructor. And there's also something called object prototypes. And this is like I think it's like one of the most popular questions within front-end interviews, because I got asked this a lot. So what's prototype? Prototype is essentially kind of like a blueprint for a particular object. So say first of all, you got a constructor. And this constructor is essentially like the same from the last one. You get a person constructor, you can create something with a new keyword. However, if we want to change this function, so say if we want to like add another property to it, for example, nationality, and we want to do this for like all the new persons that we are creating. So if we create like my father without this property like statement, we will just create a person object with all these 4 properties. And to add a new property, we need to like manually add it. Say like my father, square bracket nationality equals English. We don't want to do this for like all the objects. Since like it's pretty troublesome to like add nationality like every time we create an object. So what we can do is use the dot property method. And person dot property dot nationality equals English. And this way you will kind of like you will add the nationality property to the person blueprint of all the person object. And after you add this line, essentially all the person created onwards will have the nationality of nationality property, and the nationality property will be automatically filled in with an English value. And even though we don't like specify English or nationality somewhere in the person constructor, if we add this line into like before the object, it will automatically inject the nationality property within all the person objects created like from now on. And as you can see, like if we console.log, actually by the way, console.log is equivalent of print in Python. So it's just like logging some things in the console. And here, if we console.log my father's nationality, we'll get the result of English. So yeah. Is there any question for prototypes?
I have a question. Does this mean that if I made another person, is the nationality automatically English no matter how many new people I make?
Yeah. So this is kind of like, yeah, so essentially like this will be kind of like a trouble, right? So what people usually do is to essentially assign nationality as a function. So for example, prototype the nationality equals like assigning function, where you can input a nationality that you want, and this function will automatically like add the nationality to one of the property within the person. And so that's what like usually people do. Yeah.
When is it advantageous to use prototype though, instead of automatically just putting it inside the function, like this dot nationality equals your nationality though?
I think one of the ways to So there's something called class inheritance and also prototype inheritance. I think this is what like object prototypes really comes into play. I will introduce this like a little bit later, but I think for now, if you just want to like say add a property or add like a method to a person, I would say like adding it in the constructor will probably like be a better way to add it. This is kind of like just my way to introduce prototype. So yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, sorry for being like not really practical, but yeah. It will make much more sense when we introduce prototype inheritance, which is something pretty cool. Are there any other questions? Cool, okay. So classes. So classes is kind of like a syntax trigger of JavaScript. So before like, yes, 2015, I believe there's no classes keyword. And afterwards, due to like popular demands, people like decide to add the class keyword to JavaScript. And class functions very similar to object. It's essentially like one of the most commonly seen in object-oriented programming languages, where you can create a class, for example, called car. You can assign a constructor to the car class. And by doing this, so this is essentially like a way to define a function. And then you can define also methods within the class. So for example, here, the car method has, the car class has a method called present. And the present will essentially return, first of all, it's parameter plus comma, I have a car name. So this is essentially like telling someone that the car is existing here. So yeah. And how do we create a new class? It's essentially also very similar to creating a new object. It's by doing my car equals new car. And so this is essentially the constructor here. And by using, by like putting Ford here, the brand will become the Ford. And the constructor will essentially assign brand to the car name. And the car of instance here will have the property of this car name. And people may ask, like, since we already have object, why do we use class? This has something to do, first of all, like people are more familiar with class-based stuff, because like class inheritance is like still one of the most popular way to programming. So if you have a car, and then you can have a race car, and the race car can inherit methods from car. And like JavaScript classes essentially like behaves the same from the other languages, for example, Python or C. So yeah, this is kind of like a just another way of doing something similar in object. So yeah. Are there any questions for classes? Cool, okay. Let's move on. So JavaScript functions. So people may probably feel that JavaScript is pretty like confusing. I feel the same, because like there are like multiple ways to do something like similar in JavaScript. And this is kind of like pretty confusing. And so actually we have two kinds of ways to define a function. It's very similar to how Python has a normal like def keyword to define a function, and then use a lambda keyword to define like a one-liner function. And this is, you can draw a parallel between JavaScript and Python. Here, the def function in Python is just the normal regular function in JavaScript, where you can use the function keyword. So essentially like the function keyword, and then followed by the parameters, and followed by the function body. You can define a function this way. excuse me. Sorry. Also, there's the arrow function. The arrow function kind of is very similar to lambda function, where it's like much more concise and also easy to use. And there are like some subtle differences that we'll be covering in a short in a second. And so here, this is a syntax for an arrow function. So what does it mean by ES6 and ES5? This is essentially like the version of JavaScript. ES5 is the version before ES 2015. ES6 is essentially afterwards. And during ES6, the JavaScript released the arrow function. Essentially, it allows a quicker and more concise way to write an arrow function, Yeah. Let's see the regular function in more detail. So a regular function has something called this binding and also arguments binding. And it can be, for a regular function, it can also be called through the new keyword, just like what we have talked about in the previous object constructor slide. So if we look at this code snippet on the right, here we define a function called x. And to define it, we use the function keyword. And the function keyword essentially means that it's a normal regular function. And here you can actually console.log arguments. So there's the arguments keyword is like built into any regular functions. So the very interesting here is that you can see like there's actually no function parameters specified in the function in the bracket here. However, there's still going to be an arguments property. And you can still pass in arguments to the function that you're using. So this is kind of weird, but this is essentially like how JavaScript works. Because like JavaScript treats everything as an object and also function as an object. As a result, the arguments keyword is kind of like an inherent property of this like regular function. And so as you can see, like if we if we like call this function x, you will basically like console.log all the arguments here. And this is like the value within the arguments keyword. It's so within the arguments keyword, it's also an object. An object specifying like the zeros argument is Alex, and the first argument is 21. It's essentially like corresponds to the argument here. And also within the function here, we also have this keyword. So this keyword is something that we have already mentioned before. It's essentially a way to access the object that we are trying to create. And here we assign this .hobby equals chess. So essentially the hello object that we have just created will have this, if you access hello.hobby, you will like display chess as a result. And through this new keyword, it kind of like bind this keyword to the hello. So if you don't do the new keyword, you will actually have an error saying that like there's no like this dot binding. So new keyword is like pretty essential for creating an object. You can use it without the new keyword if you don't have like this .hobby equals chess. It's just a new normal function. You can use it without the new keyword. So yeah. Are there any questions for regular functions? Let me double check the chat. Cool. Okay. So let's see the arrow function. I think you will probably like, you can probably understand a normal function better when you can like compare it with the arrow function. So arrow function does not have its own this keyword, argument keyword, or new keyword. So essentially it's just a pure function. And so do not use arrow function for creating objects. You cannot essentially like use an arrow function to create an object. If you, for example, define an arrow function and then use a new keyword on it, you will essentially give out an error. What do we do with it? We use them for callbacks. So what's callback? Callback is essentially is a thing in functional programming where you can link, where you can pass a function to another function. So say if you want to like process a request and then do something else, for example, send a response back, you can then put the send response back function as a parameter into the process request function. And after the process request function execute all the code within it, you can call this callback function. And so this way, like this is like essentially how people use arrow function. It'll become probably like more apparent when we learn about some real life application of JavaScript. And also, arrow function is also for simplicity and elegance. So it's very similar to the lambda function in Python, where like sometimes you can just write something as a one-liner, and this basically like makes things more concise. And here, let's look at the code snippet here. So first 3 lines are the regular traditional function, where you use a function keyword, and it has essentially 3 lines. If we look at the next function, it's the arrow function. It's essentially doing the same thing, and you don't need to write the function keyword. It's essentially like a little bit more concise, but it can be much more concise when you like when there's like no side effects triggering during the arrow function. So essentially, if there's like no side effects triggering, for example, console.log or whatever things you will do, if there's only one return statement, you can omit the return statement, also omit the curly bracket, and just saying, and just basically like put a plus b here, right after the arrow. And this arrow is essentially like why the arrow function is called arrow function. And you can put it right after the arrow, and you will basically return a plus b. As you can see, this is like very similar to lambda function. It really helps to like speed things up when you are trying to code. So yeah. Any questions for arrow functions or regular functions? Cool. So let's move on. So let's see. This is a more of a like a concrete example of arrow function versus regular function. Here we look at the example of this. So this keyword behaves very different from an arrow function and between an arrow function and also a regular function. So just like I said, arrow function does not have a this binding, which means that if you are trying to access the this dot name, you will not look at the me object within it. Oh wait. Yeah, it will not look at the me object within it. However, it will reduce to something called the lexical scope. So essentially what lexical scope is the this function, the arrow function, if not found this keyword, it will look at something outside of its function. And this object is essentially like not something outside its function. However, the global scope here, the variable defined here, the name, is like the lexical scope outside of the arrow function. So it will look at the global scope and it will find the name equals arrow function. And so essentially, like if you call the arrow function here, you'll actually return example of arrow function. And if you call the regular function here, it will actually return, since the regular function has this binding, and this is able to access the name property within the me object, it will output example of regular function. So the name is regular function. And we will cover scope in definitely like much more detail later. So yeah, because like scope is a pretty tricky topic. And essentially, like what we are seeing right now here is, so if the arrow function cannot find this binding within the arrow function itself, you will look outside the arrow function, and you will look at essentially the global scope. And within the global scope, the name keyword there's a name variable here. So essentially this dot name will be bind to the name equals arrow function here. So yeah, are there any questions for this keyword binding? One key thing to remember is just to like, if you are trying to define a method within an object, try to use a regular function, because regular functions, this keyword of regular functions, it binds to the object. The arrow function, it binds to like the parent frame, or the like kind of like the environment of the object, of the the environment that the object is in. So yeah. So just the main takeaway is just to use regular function within an object. Cool, okay. So now let's talk about scope and closure in much more detail. So first of all, what is scope? Scope is essentially the accessibility of variables and functions and also objects in some particular part of your code during runtime. So, and there are like 4 kinds of scope defined in JavaScript. So this is what makes JavaScript kind of confusing. There's a global scope where it's like, if you just define a variable, for example, var first name equals Alex, you will be reside in the global scope. And there's also going to be a local scope. Some people also call it like function scope. Essentially, like it's just the variables defined within a function. And if it's say a let keyword, a let variable, it can only be accessed within a local scope. If you define it like within a local scope. Actually, like if it's a var keyword, variable is essentially still the same, because var variable and let variable will only be different like during block scope. So yeah, so this is local scope. It's variables defined within a function. And to access, like you cannot essentially access something from the global scope within the local scope. So if there's a console.log statement here in the global scope, you cannot access some variable defined here in the local scope. And there's also a thing called block scope. So block scope is essentially the if statement, or the switch statement, or the else if statement, or the else statement. Everything within the curly bracket, you can treat it kind of like a block scope. So block scope is different for let variable and var variable. We'll cover this a little bit, in a little bit like later. There's also the lexical scope. So lexical scope is what we have just mentioned. It's kind of like when there are like 2 nested functions. If one function is within another function, then this function, the lexical scope of the function within it, is the outside function. We'll cover this like in more detail later. Yeah, let's look at an example of the lexical scope. So essentially here, there's a grandfather function. There's a parent function. And within the parent function, there's also a child function. And here, here in the grandfather function, there's a name defined. And in the parent function, if you are trying to access the name defined in the grandfather function, you can access it. As you can see, there's also a likes variable defined in the child function. And if you are trying to access a likes variable within the parent function, it's not able to. So essentially, you can only access the variables from the parent function, not the child function. And this is what the lexical scope is essentially trying to convey. Actually, are there any questions? Cool. And this is like a more detailed view for block scope. And this is like let versus car versus con revisit. So if there's a if statement, this is like a dummy if statement. There are like 3 variables defined here: a var variable, a let variable, and also a const variable. And this is defined in the block scope of this if statement. As we can see, the var variable essentially ignored this block statement, block scope, and you can access it outside the block scope as well. So if you console.log name, it will still logs out the name. However, if you're trying to access the likes and the skills variable, you cannot access it through like within the block scope because it's defined within the block scope. And both let and const will be limited by the block scope. So yeah, so this is essentially like one of the ways that you can distinguish let between var. Are there any questions till this point? Oh, actually there is. So even if the code, so the question is, even if the code trying to access a child function is written below the child function, but in the scope of the parent function, wait, hang on. Even if the, yeah, so essentially you still won't access it. So essentially, let me go back. So the question is, if there's a function down here somewhere and outside the parent function, for example, let's say there's like a uncle function here. And if the uncle function is trying to say access the child function, something within the child function or something within like the parent function, can you access the variables within them? The answer is no. And essentially this is what the local scope comes into play. So the local scope will actually limit variables within the their own function. So yeah, you can only access the variables within one function inside a function. So if you're inside the function, say that this child function is nested inside the parent function, you can access it. And when it goes out of this curly bracket, you can never access it. So yeah. I mean, there are like still some ways to access it. You can use, for example, a global keyword to access some variables defining a function, but this is like, yeah, not relevant. I hope that answered your question. Are there any more questions? Cool, okay. So let's continue. Okay, so this is another very tricky topic within JavaScript. It's called closure. And so what is a closure? Closure is essentially the combination of functions bundled together with references to its surrounding states. In other words, a closure gives you access to an outer function scope from an inner function. And what does it mean? This is essentially tightly related to the lexical scope idea that we've just talked about. So let's look at these init function. Within the init function, we define a variable here. The name of the variable is just name, and it's Mozilla, the browser name. And here, within the init function, we define another function called display name. And here the display name is actually treated as a closure. And what does it mean? So essentially, you can see there's no name variable defined within the display name function. And since it cannot find the name variable defined within the within this function, it will look outside of its like current scope. It will look at its lexical scope, which is the parent function, the nested function. The parent function that's surrounding the current function. And we find the var name equals Mozilla outside the function. So essentially, the alert name, we are able to access it. And this is essentially the idea of closure. You don't need to define a variable within a function to like access it. So yeah, it's very tightly related to the lexical scope idea that we've just talked about. And if you call the function init, you will then first of all define the name variable, define the function. It will then call the display name function, and then within it, you will pop an alert and the alert will be with the text Mozilla. So yeah, this is closure. Essentially, it's just terminology for a function that uses like variables outside of its own scope. Are there any questions? Oh, cool. So the parent can't. So the question is: so the parent can't access things in its children, but the children can access things in the parent. Yeah. This is like this is essentially what lexical scope is. So parent can't access things in its children, but the children can access things in the parent. Yeah, definitely. Cool. Okay. Let's move on. So let's see an example of arrow function versus regular function. So this can be a lot. And let's see. So we first of all, let's look at the first part of this code snippet. So we first of all defined a window.age equals 10. A window is essentially like kind of like a global object within a browser. So if you open a new window within a browser, and this browser can access this window through the window object. And after you define the window.age, and you can essentially assign properties to this window object as well. Here we basically assign windows.age equals 10. And we also here define a normal function. The function is called person. And here we assign this.age equals 42. And here we have a setTimeout function. And you can, a setTimeout function is essentially a function that will execute the function that's passed in here within a certain time interval. So here, you will execute this function within the setTimeout function after 100 milliseconds. And let's look at the function within the setTimeout function. Here, it's a traditional function, and it's actually executing on the window scope. What does it mean? So here, if we console.log this.age, it will actually use 10 because the function is actually executes on the window scope. So basically, this function, it will, so basically like without creating a person object, this function alone will essentially like look up the this.age like variable in the global scope, not the window scope. Actually, it should be like the global scope. Within the global scope, there's a window object. And here, if we look at the arrow function, it's essentially pretty much the same. We define the window.age property to equals 10. And if we look at the arrow function, since we just mentioned like the arrow function does not have a binding of this, but this does not mean like the arrow function doesn't have this property. I mean, yeah, the arrow function actually does not have this property, but it does not mean that you cannot use this within an arrow function. So if you use this within the arrow function, you will essentially look at the things outside of its lexical scope. And you will basically look up this keyword within the its parent function. And what's this parent function? It's essentially the function person. And you will look up the function person here. So this.age is equal to 42. And here, the arrow function will actually output 42 as a result. So this is kind of like a very weird result because of the closure. So yeah. Are there any questions? This may be like a little bit too like 61 style, because like I feel like when you're already writing code, you shouldn't be writing like code that's this ambiguous. So yeah. But closure and scope, like the concept around closure and scope is pretty important when it comes to, for example, interviews, especially like front-end interviews. So it's pretty important to like explain it here. Cool. So let's continue. Let's talk about JavaScript array. So array base. It's just like so JavaScript array is just like a Python array, where you can like define things through the square bracket. So here we have defined a fruits array. A fruits array has the apple, banana, and lemon. You can access the fruits array through like very normal array access. It's just using the index method. So essentially, all the items within an array, it will be indexed by number. And the first element will be indexed by 0, the second one by 1, and the third by 2. You can access it through the square bracket here. And yeah, and by doing this, it will change the 0th element within the array to blueberry. So it will become like blueberry, banana, and lemon. There's also a pop method and a push method for an array. So the pop method will essentially remove the last element. Here it will remove the lemon. And the push method will push the element to the end of the array. So if you push orange, it will push an orange like to the end of the array. It will become apple, banana, and orange. Yeah, why there's no lemon? Because like the lemon is already being popped. So besides pop, you can also delete an element within an array through delete keyword. It's kind of similar to how an object functions. So yeah, so delete fruit 0, it will delete like the blueberry that we just assigned. There's also like some interesting methods that the array offers. For example, dot splice. So what does dot splice mean? So it's essentially will get rid of the first to the second object. So if you use dot splice 1, 3, you will delete the first object, the second object, and also the third object. So this is splice. You can also concatenate two arrays together using the concatenate method. So if there's another array called more fruits, you can concatenate the more fruits onto fruits. And this way you will have like both arrays will combine together. Are there any questions for arrays? Cool. There's also, wait. Oh shoot. Yeah, okay, so there's also a method called sort. And unfortunately, I think I probably like copied something wrong. This is like from the previous slide. So sorry about that. Yeah, I will definitely like finish this slide like later. Yeah. So sort, essentially, you can pass in a lambda function to sort method, and by passing a lambda method to the sort method, you can essentially like create a custom sorting method. So for example, the usual way to sort an array is basically like by just like looking at the first character within the string. So the apple will be the first one, the banana will be the second one, the lemon will be the third one. This is like by ascending orders. However, if you can pass in say a customized lambda array, you can then look at like the last character within the word. So here it will be like banana, apple, and the lemon. So this is sort. There's also iterations. And iterations, we have, so JavaScript provide some ways to do iterations besides a for loop. And what is that? That is essentially a method called for each. And for each method essentially allows you to iterate through all the elements within the array. And here you can see there's a function that's defined here. And for each method essentially takes a function and applies this function to all the items within the array. And notice that the for each method actually does not return anything. So if you want to create a new array, you will probably use the map method. So the map method is very similar to for each. You are like apply the function onto each element. However, you will return a new array after like apply the function to each element. So here you apply a function with input name, and it will basically concatenate name column to the name. And the new array will be like name column space Alex, name column space Bob, name column space Kathy, yeah, and so on. So yeah, so this is map. Essentially, like when you're trying to create a new array, you use map. When you're trying to just trigger some side effects, for example, concatenate all the strings together, you use for each method. Any questions so far? Cool. Yeah, so there's also the array filter method. It's essentially a way to filter out some elements that's not like fulfill some condition. And it also takes in a function. Actually, here the function has always been like lambda function, but it can also be a normal function. And here it's essentially saying we look at the word, we look at each word, and if the word dot length is larger than 6, we will preserve the word. So essentially, when here the function returns true, we will preserve the word. If the function returns false, we'll then basically eliminate the word. So here, after this filter function, we'll have the exuberant, destruction, and present. The 3 words both have, all of them have like a length larger than 6. So yeah, so this is array filter method. Cool. So let's talk about JS DOM. So what is JS? So first of all, actually, what is DOM? DOM is a very important concept in web development, where it's essentially a data structure that the browser will create when it's loading up a page. It's essentially all the HTML tags within your HTML code, and also all of its content. And when a web page is being loaded up into the browser will parse all the HTML tags into a tree-like structure. And each tag will become an individual separate node. And nesting tags will become like branches or leaves on the trees. So for example, title will become here the leaves of the tree, and its branches will become like head. And JavaScript can have some very powerful methods to manipulate DOM tree. And this is the main way that we can like use JavaScript to operate on the HTML documents. Let's see some examples. So use JavaScript to update DOM. First of all, how do we include JavaScript within HTML? We use the script tag to include JavaScript within HTML. You can also use link, kind of like how you can link to CSS files. You can also use links to link to JavaScript files. You can like look it up in Google. It's like pretty convenient. But here we will just like use script tag. How do we access a document object? We access it through the document keyword. So just document. And on the document keyword, on the document object, there's a method called getElementById. And this method allows us to essentially capture the HTML tag that has a specific ID, for example, demo. And after we use this method, we can capture the HTML element, and then we can use .inner HTML to change the inner HTML of this element. So as you can see here, the P tag here does not have anything within the P tag. So essentially, like there's no content within this paragraph. We can add the hello world to this paragraph by using the .inner HTML to change like the content within the paragraph. So this is essentially like how we use JavaScript to update DOM. Any questions so far? Cool. And now more DOM methods. So these are like more useful DOM methods. And sorry, excuse me. And they're like here. So we just covered the get element by ID method. There's also get elements by class name. And notice it's get elements, not get element. And this is like very important distinguish between like get elements by class name and all get elements by tag name with like get element by ID. So essentially, get elements by class name, you will return a list of HTML elements, and you can access it through like this array indexing. And you can also change the inner HTML. So essentially, you can. So let's look at the example here. So we have. So for instance, this here, get elements by class name. It gets all the HTML tags that has the class name of description, which is like this two. And it will return this as an array. And then we get the first element within this array, which is like this second description. And we change its inner HTML to become description. And here, the document get elements by tag name, yeah, it gets essentially like the first, second, third. It gets this three tag, and it will return this as an array of tags. And we access the second one, which is like 0, first, also second. And we change its inner HTML to become second description. So essentially like the previous JavaScript is like kind of like wrong because like this should be second description. So we change it to the second description. So these are kind of like ways that you can change HTML. You can also update the style within for an HTML tag. So essentially like by using title.style.color, yeah, first of all, we get the title by using the get element by ID method. After we get the title, we can access this style through the style property. And within the style property, there's also the color property. And we can change the color property to blue. And my first page will essentially become blue. So this is how do you like manipulate DOM. Any questions so far? Cool. There's also the window object. So the window object that we actually mentioned this like a while ago, it's essentially the browser window that the user creates. And to operate on the window object, you use the window keyword. And there's actually quite a lot of cool methods for the window keyword. For example, here, there's this open win methods there's this open win function that we define here. And by using the window.open methods, we can create a new window. So essentially here, there's a button that the user can click. And when it's clicking, when the user is clicked the button, the open win method will trigger, the open win function will trigger, and it will create a new window within the user's browser. So this is pretty cool. You can kind of like actually force users to create a window. So yeah, you can like write a for loop, say like window.open 100 times, and there will be like 100 window open. So yeah, so that's that. And finally, you can also traverse the DOM tree. So for people that have finished 61B, tree is essentially a very useful data structure since we can like traverse them. So as traverse is essentially like going through all the nodes. And here, this is a way to traverse the tree. We won't go into this in detail, but this is like a depth first search for traversing the tree. Essentially, you will reach the one node to its like end, and then you will come back and to search for another node. And this is very like useful when you're trying to like just traverse all the HTML DOM and basically like see what one website is made of. This is very useful when you're, for example, scraping something. So yeah. Cool. So I think that's it. Yeah. So this is it for all our slides for JavaScript 1. And I will end the recording here.